Mr. Calvin. Welcome to another Creole Heartbeat program for another Friday. I'm not sure what's wrong with my mic. Let us see. Okay, bon. Tout bagaille bien. Présent, messieurs, mesdames. Welcome to the Creole Heartbeat program. It's a pleasure to be with you once again. It's a Friday, and it's according to the folks in America, it should be Black Friday, Thanksgiving yesterday, when they gave thanks for every aspect of life and liberty. It's a pleasure to be with you in Radio Land once again. I'm with someone extremely special to Dominica. One was done so much work for Dominica. One was done a tremendous work in collecting all the data that's necessary to link us to our ancestors, to link us to our history, to link us to our legacy. And that's Dr. Lennox Honeychurch, a historian, an author, anthropologist, a journalist, broadcaster, actor, politician, poet, painter, artist, carnival lover, carnival costume builder, designer, lecturer, tour guide, and the list continue to go on and on. He just released a book, and we have a copy of the book. It's Resistance, Refuge, and Revival, the Indigenous Kalinagos of Dominica. So what we will do, we'll kind of bring abreast to Dominica and those listening to us with the kind compliments of Digicel, a historic, let's say, a historical documentary on the book itself and connect us to our Kalinago history. Good morning to you, Dr. Honeychurch.
Well, good morning. Good morning. Good to be in your studio here this morning. And thank you for inviting me as well.
I hope that everything is okay with you. I mean, we are so privileged and blessed to have someone like you who has really done so much for Dominica.
Well, yes, I survived. I had a broken arm and all that. I went behind mangoes in July, which I must realize I'm not, I'm not my young spring chicken I used to be before. But I must say the nurses, doctors up at the China Friendship Hospital were very good. Alford Ward staff, and I got through okay.
And you have written so much of our history, so much. You have done so much research for us, and have documented several books. Even prior to this one, tell us about the books that you have actually released. And, we'll get into this one.
Yeah, well, it started off with the Dominica story when I was working at what was then Radio Dominica. And I felt myself and the wider community that there was not enough information about Dominica. People didn't generally know much about the island. So I felt if I started a little radio program in the morning, like a little 8 to 10 minutes, and did it like episode going through the whole history of Dominica, ending on an exciting note every morning so people would tune in for the next morning. And it worked out very well. I did a lot of research and did my own programs there in the studios of what is now DBS, thanks to people who are long gone, like Barnett Defoe and others who assisted with promoting and pushing it. And so when it was over, people said, oh, but we enjoy that so much, so you should turn it into a book. So I turned it into a book. But as you know, it's one thing to talk on the radio, but it's another thing to actually kind of record everything. So I took the script and I rewrote it. And that came out before you were born, 1975. And then it was republished in 84 and then in 1995. Meanwhile, now, lots of other things were brewing. People were asking me, because of the book, to do other books about like the wider Caribbean. So I produced a textbook series, which is still going strong. That is the Caribbean People, book 1, book 2, book 3. And then I branched out into other things. I was always in the Dominica story. I had 2 chapters about the Maroons. And I felt it was a very important aspect of Dominica's history and heritage. So eventually I collected lots of information, not only here, but in Britain. A lot of these documents exist in the archives in Britain. And I put together this book, In the Forest of Freedom, the fighting Maroons of Dominica. And then now I felt, okay, well, I have a general history. I did the Maroons, but it is time to deal with the Kalinago people and make people recognize what a very important part of Dominica, Waitukubuli, or heritage that it is. Because for years, of course, these people were neglected. So we have to bring help. They're doing their own thing. They're bringing themselves to the fore, but we got to help them.
Absolutely. And you recently had the launching of the book.
That's right. And there was a launching in London. I wasn't there, but we did it by remote at the Dominica High Commission on the 19th of September, which is actually Kalinago Day. And I'll explain later why that 19th of September is so important. And then here now, about 2 weeks ago, we had the local launching.
2 Tuesdays ago.
2 Tuesdays, thank you. You have been well covered.
Yeah, because I wanted to attend, but it clashed with a Creole program I'm normally doing if kept that same evening.
Oh, yes.
So it was almost impossible to be in two places at
Right.
the same time. Okay, with time short, let's delve into the book itself. And I will more or less be like a student listening to the professor and the one who I've admired for basically all my life. The Kalinagos coming to the islands from South America.
Yes, so essentially what the book does, it follows it through from way back in archaeology, because long before Europeans came to the Caribbean, there is evidence in the soil because of the things that the people made. So the first section of the book, it's divided into three. The first section is resistance, because that resistance was important for all of us, because by taking advantage of the mountainous nature of Dominica, the Kalinagos were able to hold on to Waitukubuli longer than anywhere else. So we were the last island in the Caribbean to be colonized. So that was an important contribution. And then all of the things, even in the Creole language, and so the words, Dominicans, even if they are not Kalinago, and even if they don't realize it, they are the largest number of speakers of the Kalinago language in the world. Wow. When we say yeah and Accra, not Accra, but the Titiwi, and all these words, Sirik and all that, we're using Kalinago words, but we don't really realize it because it's all part of the Creole. So we have, first I talk about how they came to the islands, the life on Waitukubuli, the Spanish arrive, and then when they begin to realize they're beginning to be colonized so heavily, there is a chapter on this, because one of the Kalinago chiefs went to one of the missionary priests and he said, our people are becoming in a manner like yours. We don't even recognize ourselves. Right. So, and then the winners and the losers, that is, after the resistance and the, of course, massacres that happened. So if we begin with the arrival, before the arrival, I'm going to look there. Coming to the islands, yes. Of course, all of the indigenous people that first populated our island came from South America, from the area facing Trinidad. So you have the whole Orinoco River, you have the Orinoco Delta, and then you have down in the Guyanas. So they would come up, and the closest island to South America in that area was Trinidad. And in fact, once upon a time, thousands of years ago, the sea level was lower, and you could actually walk across to Trinidad. And then from Trinidad, they moved up the islands, first of all to Tobago, then they could see the clouds over and above Grenada. Once they got to Grenada, they could see every island as they went. You go to the south of Dominica, you see Martinique. You go to the north of Dominica, you see Marie-Galante, Guadeloupe, and Les Saintes. So you go on, So this whole area, they were able to populate. But there were people, that is the Kalinagos, but there were people here before. Now, I know in the textbooks and so they talk about Arawaks, but this is not a name that the people use for themselves. We don't even know fully what their name was. But what we do have is the pottery that the people made. So the first set of people to come to Dominica and the other islands, they were what you call hunter-gatherers. They didn't make pottery and they didn't plant. They gathered, they hunted, they fished, and objects that they produced are still there. So you identify that set. And then you had the next group who were called, well, the archaeologists. You see, they give these names. It's very confusing because they give these names to the pottery style. So they identify, okay, that's the next set of people that came from South America, and their style is, we call it saladoid because we first saw it in a site at Saladero in the Orinoco River. And that style comes all the way up the islands. So the first pottery we find in Dominica is the Saladoid pottery, which is associated with the people you would maybe call Arawak. Sometimes they were called Igneri. The problem is that, people were not there at the time, so they don't know what to say and what to put down. Now, a big site of these people was in Soufrière, down south, Soufrière and Scott's Head. But what happened is that in 450 AD, there was this giant eruption of Monpatat volcano. And luckily there was warning because there was lots of tremors. The people left, but their village was covered in ash. So all underneath the present day village of Soufrière are these artifacts. So I have some pictures of them in the book and all that. So you had that group, and then you had another groups coming up, and they were all given the names depending on the style of pottery they had. Trumassoid, because there's a river in St. Lucia, Trumassé, and that pottery was found near there, But the pottery that is associated with the Kalinago people is a pottery that is called Caillou, after a river in St. Vincent. So that was where that pottery type was first seen, and then it came up to the islands. And at Woodford Hill, for instance, where every year I get a group of university people to come and they do digging, they have found there the pottery of those early Kalinago people. So we have found that there,
Continue, yeah.
Yes. So essentially, it is through the pottery, and then you get those missionaries coming up the islands. People that most famous of them, the French missionaries, and we find out from their documents what life was like at the time. So it's a mixture of things. You have the archaeology, the pieces, the pottery, and all that. Then you have the artifacts that are described, canoes, cassava processing, and basketry, and the way of life. And then you will have the descendants of the indigenous people themselves who have information. And today, of course, we know some of the names like Prosper Paris and Manly Langley and Miranda and all of these groups.
Absolutely. What about the way of life of the Kalinago and Mighty Kubali?
Yes, well, the way of life essentially was very close to nature.
Who actually named the island Mighty Kubali?
It was the Kalinagos.
Okay, great.
As they came up the island, of course, if you are coming from Martinique, which that is the French name, but the earlier name, and the first island you would come to, as you approach it, you see those hills behind Grand Bay and Soufrière and all that. And I mean, they're massive and they're going straight up out of the sea, all in the area of Petite Savane and Point Caribe and Grand Bay and so. So, it looked very much like it was tall. And for them, the land, nature was always a woman, because women bear fruit if they bear children, and the land bears fruit. So it's always a woman, you see. So that is why tall is her body. Okay? And
the way of life.
And the way of life on Waitukubuli essentially was very close to nature. Now, they brought a lot of this knowledge from South America, and including in their canoes, they brought things that they needed up here, like manioc, cassava. That's a basic food. So although you had your stews and you made your things out of fish and maniku and agouti and whatever, but you used the cassave to almost as a spoon to eat the food that you were producing. Then their knowledge of all of the types of trees, what different trees were good for. And in fact, here in the forest, we have a lot of Kalinago names. We have Kubawi and names like that, Karapat and all kinds of Akaju, all kinds of names that actually we still use today, but they are indigenous Kalinago names. So their knowledge of the forest, the knowledge of the herbs. I mean, they had shamans. The shamans were the people who kind of, they knew the spirit world. And they knew also the different types of plants you would take, like narcotics. So it always amuses me, and I put it in the book, that they have laws against marijuana, but there are 20 narcotics, some of them very much more powerful than marijuana, and there's no law against them at all. But you would have to know which ones there are in the forest. So you would go to these shamans and consult with them, and they would be able to tell you what was there and how it could affect you. And also they were very good herbalists. So they would provide you, because you see, their world was a fight between good and bad spirits. Yeah, the bad spirit is the one we still call Mabuya. Yeah, the Mabuya that doesn't look so nice crawling on the ceiling. So, people, in their language, that was the devil. That was the bad one, Mabuya. And so there was always this fight. And if you were sick, it meant that, an evil spirit was affecting you. This is how the belief was. So you went to the shaman, the name we still use today, Piai, the Piai man.
Obia man.
Obia is more African term, yeah. But Piai was the indigenous term. So you'd go and he would concoct something for you to relieve your pressure on this particular situation, whatever it was. So there's a whole spirit world there too. And you see, the thing is that a lot of the landscape that we have in Dominica, they associated it with the spirit world. So you have L'Escalier Teche, and a whole story related to L'Escalier Teche at Seneco, that when all the world was soft, and it was soft at one time with the volcanoes, this master Teche snake came up out of the sea. And as he arrived and continued up on the mountain, everything, the route that he had followed went hard like a staircase. So that's why you have the L'Escalier Teche. Yeah. And all the other animals followed up. So that's one. And then we have overlooking Pegua and Tristle. We have the Pegua Rock, Wash Pegua, and Twistle or Guan Wash. Their names for it. But there are stories related to that rock as well, that you have to go and fight. Once again, a Teche, you have to fight a Teche. And I've met Teches up there, so I know they exist. Up there in the crack, you go up the crack, you find a flower. There's a special flower supposed to be growing there. Go down in the Pegua River, wash yourself with it, and then you can command whosoever you wish. So, some of these were just folklore stories they told on nights. Remember, we're talking about a time without radio, without TV. So you made up your stories, and you looked up at the stars, and the stars, you interpreted what the stars were and all of that. So that was part of it. Then, of course, we have to skip to the houses that they built. Yeah. The big house was actually called a tabui, but then another group of people from South America came up and they started calling it the Kabe. Yeah. So now we talk about the Kabe, but the indigenous Kalinagos originally had called it the Tabui. So you had this big house, and that was the men's house and the community house where everybody gathered. And then around it, you had these smaller round houses where the women and the children would live. So the men were up there in their hammocks in the big house. Mm-hmm. And in front of it was a plaza-like, an open space that where they would do their dances and performances and gather together. Now there are two of those that are remaining, and we still use them. Two of those. One is in Collyho. So when you go to the center of Collyho, there is a place, it's open, uh, near the cemetery called La Place Dame. That is one of the remaining plazas. And the other one is close to us while we're sitting here. It's in the Roseau Market. So because that was the landing place, people brought their canoes right in front there by Fort Young, and that was the big landing place. That was where all the Kalinagos gathered. So we have one remaining there and the other, but they were all over the place, you know. So we did about, and food, of course, we talk about the whole processing of cassava, which is a very interesting thing. I have a whole chapter on that because of the fact that you had to remove that poisonous juice from it. But once you removed it and you made your farine or your cassava or whatever, that could last a long, long time, you know. And even when the Europeans came, they would prefer to eat the cassava because by the time their bread came from Europe or the white flour, farine France, it would all be pooey and moldy and all that kind of stuff. So that is their food and their knowledge of the land, their farming, and the whole cycle. There were women's work and there was men's work, right? So they always wanted the women to plant, put the thing in the soil because once again, women are fertile and whatever. So the men would prepare the gardens in the dry season. And when the wet season came, the women would put in the shoots for the cassava manioc, the planting of the sweet potato. They had a lot of corn as well, all of those things. So you had the year was divided into dry season and wet season. Dry season, what you did in dry season, you covered made your huts, you covered your cabe and all of that. You made canoes, the final part of the canoes. All of those things were mainly men's work. And then in the wet season, you had your women's work. They were making hammocks and they were planting. And the women really worked a lot hard. All the comments that you see in the old documents is the women just silently went about their work.
I always wondered, Doctor, how they survived the natural, let's say, hurricanes.
Oh, well, they knew about that. And of course,
and the signs they would have seen and how they would actually protect themselves.
Right. Well, the hurricanes, they were very knowledgeable about that because the thing is, and I have it in the book, the huracan, that was the indigenous people up in the Great Antilles, you know, like Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica. The Taino people, they call it the huracan. And that was the storms. Down in the islands, the Kalinagos had different words for this. Some of them rather complicated about but it was the same cycle. Your huracan, and it was all tied to spirits too. You had the spirit of the storm, and she had two helpers. One was responsible for the water and the other for the wind. And when you reflect even on Hurricane Maria, you realize that the water was one major force, and then the wind was another. You know, so that is also described in the book. It goes through a few pages. So I won't go over it here because we have to pack in so much. But essentially, yes. And they had knowledge about its coming because they were very good at working out the swell in the sea, the clouds, what type of clouds, where the clouds were moving, and the birds, those big fuiga birds. They were very important because usually they're out at sea, you never see them. But then when they would come in, because they're seeking refuge up in the mountains, whatever, they would identify, a storm is coming, you know. And unfortunately, in St. Kitts and one or two other places after the European English and the French came, they would go and warn them. The Kalinagos warned in St. Kitts is a case in point, where they warn them that in a day or two there will be this mighty storm that's coming. And oh, it's nonsense. How can you tell us that? Because the sky is blue, the sea is calm, and you're telling us a storm is coming. But he said it is. When the storm came, these ungrateful people turned around and accused them of witchcraft, that they had dealing with the devil, so they knew. And others would say, oh, you put the storm particularly on us because you feel we're taking over your land. So, But anyway, that, of course, is jumping ahead because we have the arrival of Columbus and the Spanish. Yeah. Well, Columbus was a Genoese, which is a part of Italy. He was an Italian, and he was sailing these ships on behalf of the Spanish crown. First voyage, he had 3 ships. He didn't know where he was. He miscalculated the size of the world. He thought it was much smaller, so therefore he could go across to China. And he did not realize that in between China and Europe, there was this big continent, the Americas. So when he arrived in the Bahamas, he was kind of lost. Anyway, he met these people, but they told him about other people that are down to the southwest over there. And that was the Kalinagos they were describing. So he knew there was another set of people. So when he went back to Spain and said what he had found and everything, well, there was no doubt that time he got 17 ships, 1,500 crew, and he headed to Dominica. But he had heard that these islands existed. So he came down, but he could not find any place to land all these ships and people in Dominica, because he would have arrived somewhere off Saint-Sauveur, Castle Bruce, moved up, nothing, couldn't see anything. But then he saw Marigallant. So, it was called Aishi, and he renamed it Marigallant after his ship. Of course, he renamed Waitukubuli Dominica because it was a Sunday. So Dies Dominica in Latin is the day of our Lord. So that is it. Then Guadeloupe, because he had prayed at a monastery in Spain. And Todos los Santos is Les Îles des Saints, because the day before he had celebrated the Feast of All Saints, November 1st, November 2nd. And so he could not land. But he went and put his flag and his crucifix and all that in Marigallant. Then he went across to Guadeloupe. And that is where this whole business about cannibalism reputation starts, because he misunderstood what he had seen. He saw these like a skull, bones in the ceiling, but human beings all over the world, including Europeans, put skulls into either of their ancestors or of their enemies. So that was a misconstrued thing. But when you want to exploit somebody, you always pile on bad things about them. And from that time, he had already considered that they would be enslaving the Kalinagos to go and work up in Puerto Rico and Hispaniola and Jamaica. So from that time, you get these terrible accusations against the Kalinago people. Cannibalism was just one thing. The mere fact they walked around naked was another. So all these priests and bishops and so were writing these terrible things to Spain, and then Spain was saying, "Oh, well, you can capture them and you can sell them duty free as slaves in San Juan and Santo Domingo and wherever else." So that's how that reputation started, and it went up to today. I put in the book, I was very shocked once. While I was working on this book, I was helping somebody from territory to take some material to Longhouse in Portsmouth. This is a couple of years ago. And we went into a bar. They have these little places you can get food and all that. So we ordered something to eat. We sat down. A big able man comes into the shop and he said, "Yeah, so what you have for me to eat this afternoon?" And then he looks across and he sees these Kalinago guys who were traveling with me. And he said, "Oh, I see you have Kalinagos here. You have any human meat for sale this afternoon?" I turned to Irvin Sugis. I said, "Irvin, that still is there. It still happens. You tell me, Lennox, well, you don't know the worst of it. You know what they, even children at school sometimes, what they have to go through with this business. So that's a whole thing that has stained the reputation for a long time. And Columbus had picked up the word in the Greater Antilles about these Caribes, Calinas, all these things. So when he came down, he called them Caribs. So it was only much later that when those French missionaries came, Father Breton and them, that they said, you know, they're always calling us Caribs, but that's what the Spanish called us, but really our name is Kalinago. That's how that whole thing came about. So Columbus arrives, he goes to these places, and he comes back and he returns to Spain through the channel between Dominica and Guadeloupe. Now, by that time, he has sent somebody to look for in Dominica for a wonderful place to anchor, safe harbor. And the man finds what we now call as Portsmouth, Guantans, Prince Rupert Bay. For the Kalinagos, it was Oyuhao. So that bay then, from then on, became the most important spot for the Kalinago people if you came, you're Spanish or whatever, and you came and you didn't ask permission of the chief of Oyuhao for permission to go and get water or whatever, they would attack you. So there were some big attacks there in the bay at Portsmouth. You know, it has three nice rivers. You have the North River, Indian River, Picard River, sandy beach to land, forest inside, hot water springs. All of these things are there. And so it was a very favorable place. And so all the English and the French and the others who followed the Spanish and the Dutch, they all came into that bay, and we have pictures and all that about them. So that then was the beginning. But what happened with Dominica is, because of the mountains and because of the resistance of the Kalinago people, that is why the first part is called resistance. So they realized now that people were coming from settling other islands that were easier, like Antigua, St. Kitts, Marie-Galante, and so, and they were coming closer and closer to Dominica. So they went out now to try to fight them, to make sure they didn't come any closer. They didn't mind them coming and trading because they would get some axes, which was easier than the stone axes that they used to make. So, but they did not want the people to take over their land. And there were some big altercations. For instance, today, we still use the name Anse du Mai. Anse du Mai. Now, the origin of that word is because there was a French captain called Captain Dumais, and he was settling in Marie-Galante. So when the Kalinagos in the north of Dominica saw this, they went out and they raided his village, burnt it down, and came back. But the guy raised French people who survived and came and attacked the village in that very bay. And up to today, we call it Anse du Mai. Okay? Similar thing happened some years later at where we call Massac. Now, that whole area, the flat area of Canefield, was known as Boerie. That's why you have the Boerie River, because they believe that, they are right, that the river that goes through Canefield comes from the Boerie Lake. So, Boerie. And that's a whole story. It's a fascinating story, but what happened is, back up in St. Kitts, this guy called Thomas Warner, he had a Kalinago mistress, woman. He was married to his English wife, but he had a Kalinago mistress called Barbie. And she had a son with him, who they call Carib Warner or Indian Warner, but his correct name was Thomas Warner, after his father. And you know, he was brought up in his father's house, so he knew the ways of the English, he knew the ways of the French and all that. But when his father died, his English stepmother mistreated him very bad. He was a teenager by that time. And so he left and he came back to his mother's people in Dominica, and he rose up to be a chief. And they were frightened of him because he was uneducated, highly educated. He spoke French, he spoke English, spoke a bit of Spanish, and he had been made an acting governor by the people in Barbados. So they came down to, that's one of his half brothers, Philip came down to Dominica with some people in a ship, and they said, we're going to entertain them, give them rum, invite them on board. And when you see me slit the neck of my half brother, kill everybody, go down the shore, rape and burn and all that. And that's what happened there. And that is why it is massacred today. Okay. So you see the kind of tension and resistance and action that was going on. So next step now, we go to number 2. Yes. That is the refuge time. So bit by bit, the Kalinago people, although they fought and they stood, they were being weakened because of the main thing being all these tools and things that the Europeans were bringing down. Axes, cutlasses, scissors, all these things that could cut, that would improve their lives. So they would go and trade their tobacco and their cassava and all that kind of thing to get these things. Then they began giving away land, right? We have a famous case down in Granby where this guy comes across from Martinique and he makes some deals and he gets the chunk of land. And in fact, the cross that this man made is still at the top of, not Lally, but the top of the cemetery. The one there, you're right, there's another cross at the top of Lally, but this one associated with it because you see, the Spanish had treated the Kalinagos very, very badly. I mean, they murdered them, they slaughtered them, they tortured them, and everything that they saw the cross. I mean, there was one guy in Cuba when he was being put to burn. They told him, you have one more chance. You can become a Christian, and we will spare you. He said, this heaven you talk about, are there Spanish people in heaven? And the priest said, but yes, there are lots of Spanish people in heaven. Well, in that case, light the fire. I would prefer to go to the thing you all call hell than to go to this heaven where all these Spanish people were. So they hated the cross because of what had been done to them by the people who carried the cross. And that is why they burnt every cross, they tore down every cross that was built at Granby. And at the end, the guys...
So they resisted Christianity.
They resisted it. Mm-hmm. In fact, in one place where I mentioned in the book, where the French are trying very hard to attempt, they say, look, our God, our spirits know our life. They know how to make our cassava grow and whatever. You all spirit is all about sheep. We don't ever heard about sheep before. Mouton and all that kind of business. And also your wheat and the growing, because they associated this big spirit with giving you gifts from the soil and all that. And so they said, yes, that God you're trying to persuade us to worship and all that, that's all right for you all. But for us, he doesn't know about how our life is and how it works, you know. It's an amazing statement to make. But they resisted. So that's all part of the resistance. But eventually, bit by bit, they had to retreat because the French people and also people from deserters from ships, and a lot of these families, that French families, they were poor, they were on the plantation, and they were shifting across to Dominica. Their names are still with us. Royer and Leblanc and Darrow and Durand, and Sorrento. And all these are names that came across. And very often the Kalinagos adopted those names. That is why if you go in territory, you will find that most of the surnames are French. Mm-hmm. Because in those days when the French were baptizing them later on in life, baptizing them, they would have a godparent, and it was always a French godparent. So they would name the person after the godparent's surname, right? Mm-hmm. So hence Darrow, Durand, or Auguste, whatever.
How did they actually survive the whole slavery operation?
Well, that thing. By the time slavery arrived in Dominica, both the English and the French had given up on the Kalinagos. In fact, they say it's no use. You know, these people will rather kill themselves than to work for us. So it's no use even bothering to try to force them. And what was happening too is they were taking over, that is the English, First the French, but then the English when they captured Dominica right here on the bayfront in Roseau in 1761. They took over the whole island and they brought out surveyors to cut everything into lots for sale. And that was for sugar cane. Now, sugar cane is a thing you need to cut the forest completely down from one end to the next. And this was a land on which the Kalinago people, not only did they plant, but they hunted. You had crabs, you had agouti, manikou, all these things, and you're cutting down all this forest. So bit by bit, they retreated. That's the refuge part. They took refuge in the rugged East Coast where the English didn't want because the ravines were too deep and the sea was too rough and all of that kind of thing. So they eventually took refuge in this corner of Dominica. But an interesting thing is that you see today, and I mention it in the book, that a lot of them mixed with these Europeans that were coming down. All these Darus, Durans, and so that I talk about at places like Petit Savan and Saint-Sauveur and Good Hope and whatever. They mixed with all these people, and then the people mixed with Africans. So if you did a DNA test in Dominica, massive, like was done in Puerto Rico, you would find there are many more people. They don't maybe look Kalinago, but their DNA is strong Kalinago. This happened in Puerto Rico, where people in Puerto Rico up in the 1950s and 60s were saying, well, the Spanish came and they killed off all the Taino people. But in 2010, 2011, there was a study done on the DNA, and they found that actually 60% of the people of Puerto Rico have Taino ancestry and DNA in them. And I'm sure that if you did that in Dominica, people that you would think, oh, they, straight from Africa or whatever, they have Kalinago DNA in them.
How did the Kalinago assisted the Maroons, the Negmao?
Well, what happened is, this is a difficult thing because what happened is when the British introduced sugar, then is when you got the big arrival of Africans. And the Kalinagos were not employed. They were not seized as slaves. So they kept themselves away. But what they did is they would provide food to the people that is the English, mainly the English and the French in the plantations. And remember, they're silently going through the forest, so they're providing food because the Maroons, the Negma or the Maroons, are up in the forest in the center of the island. And if they try to go down to the coast, they run the risk of passing some estate and being caught. So the Kalinagos quietly would then give. But the thing is, we never find any, whereas we find all these notices about the names of people who are runaways and they are on the run, so we will reward you for capturing any of these people like Bala and Congo Ray and all these people. These people were captured, they were executed, whether in the Roseau market or wherever, and the people who betrayed them were given money, right? But in the case of the Kalinagos, we even see writing where a person is, I have it in the book, it says, Brigo, rather like the Buigo, the Carib, he lives on Mr. Laron's estate. And then there is also Joe, who is the slave of Mr. Laron. So you see, they make a difference between the Kalinago, who simply lives on Mr. Laron's estate, versus Joe, who is a slave. So it was a very ticklish, but in history, sometimes we get this impression of the Kalinagos, fighting with the Maroons and all that. There was help, but it wasn't, because you never saw a notice for a reward for Kalinago, because they were doing their business quietly. Yeah.
But in terms of any wars between, let's say, the Europeans
Yes.
and the Kalinagos. Were there any data to show the resistance of the Kalinagos towards those wars?
Oh yes, because but all of that happened early on. The thing I told you about Astime,
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
thing, all of these.
So that's why they eventually left them alone.
That's right. It was a tactic, like you see it in histories of wars. Look, you all have taken our land. We know that our forces are not sufficient, but we are going to ignore you. We are going to pull like a strike. We're going to pull ourselves away, and you all will be on the west coast and up in the hills along the west coast, and we will be out in the east, and we will continue to live and maintain our lives. So that's why I have these big chapters on the boat building, because they made canoes. That's one of the ways in which they gain money. They continue to make canoes. So sometimes the estates would buy canoes, or they would go and sell canoes in Marigaland or Martinique, particularly Martinique, and all that. So their life, it was as if two lives were happening in the same island. Like they were going ahead doing their business, and the whole business of colonization and enslavement and the arrival of West Africans and all that was taking place at the same time.
Why do you think, Doc, in terms of Kalinagos throughout the Caribbean, who possibly safer in the hills of Dominica than the other islands?
Well,
because of the hills.
Yes, it happens. One other place, but not as extensive, is in St. Vincent. Now, the thing is, the Spanish crown, they declared, we have the documents here, where the King and Queen of Spain, they declare that you can go and any of these islands south of Puerto Rico, raid them and capture the Kalinagos and take them and sell them. And if you can't catch them, you send dogs behind them and whatever. But in the case of Dominica, they couldn't get further than the coast, you see, because of the mountains. They hid themselves, they had ambushes. They talk about these ambushes and thousands of arrows, as they even say that Kalinago can shoot 4 arrows in the time that it takes an Englishman to load a gun. So you can imagine you have pew, 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 one after the other, you know. So yeah, that was the power, but it was the land, because they swept, that is the Spanish, first of all, and the others. All Antigua, they swept them off, they killed them. All the smaller, flatter islands, St. Kitts and all of that. Don't talk about Barbados and Marigaland and these places. They just went through and with dogs, and they captured, and those they killed, those they seized. So Dominica, with its mountains and rugged, they in fact introduced, as I have in the other book I have about the Maroons, the Kalinagos introduced the African arrivals who went to be Maroons to all the little secret hideaways, all the ravines and the places like Bell's Jaco Flats and all these plateaus that had cliffs at the back, down by Delis and all these places.
So they played an important role in actually assisting the Maroons.
Yes, telling them about the island. This is island. This is how you can deal with it
and survive.
And survive. So it was all about survival.
The Kalinago territory or Carib Reserve, there,
yes,
as it was called. Bring us up to date.
Right. Well, that's so. Slavery is abolished, and the African enslaved, they want 14,000 of them, are told on the days before emancipation, these houses that you're in are not yours. The land that you farm, it is not yours, but you must continue to work for your master. And so, and many of them decided they're going to squat. Yeah. So what happened is you find these villages on the edge of 2 estates. Like you'll find Grand Fond and Rivière-Syrique and Mont Jean and all these places up there, and then on the west coast they had a 66 yards between the sea and the land, which was government, and they knew it was government, so they left their estates broke down their little tikais, and they put it down on the shore. And that is why places like Maho and Bodlames and Joe and all that are so crowded, because they had to pack themselves. But that is where they could escape to. However, with the reserve now, that this is the interesting thing, is we had a administrator who came, and those days, of course, no elections, and the British men were sent out to manage the affairs. So there was this guy called Hesketh Bell, Henry Hesketh Bell, and he had studied all about the indigenous people, and he felt that there
And he was English.
he was English, and he felt that a piece should be left for them, right? Because he writes, all these letters I got in England, and I have them in the book here, where he writes and he says, the area that was identified for them has never been regularized. There's no proper boundary. There's nothing. And so in 1903, 4th of July, in the official gazette in Dominica, there was issued this statement that that these lands in the parish of St. David shall be reserved for in those days, they would call them the Carib people and whatever. And then he went and he chose one of the people who were competing to be chief. He chose one of them, Francis Auguste, to be the first officially recognized Kalinago chief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What process that was used during those days?
It was just selection. It was just like they would decide who is a kind of most respected man in the community and whatever. In fact, there was a priest who, later on the Roman Catholic Church was actually given 14 acres to build a church, and then the school was put there and everything, down in the valley in Salibia. The land is still there, and it's still owned by the Roman Catholic Church. It's inside the territory, but it dates from before 1904. So what happens is one of these priests, he collected about 150 Kalinagos in a field. He describes it. And he says, I asked them to select the person who they would like to be their chief. Mm-hmm. And so they selected this guy, and then he was. But there were many other chiefs before. Garnet Joseph has recorded, mm-hmm. and I repeat his records here, he has recorded all those early chiefs. Mm-hmm. When the British came, the chief that they recognized was this Francis Auguste. And then he got old, and they replaced him with somebody called Jules Corriette. Mm-hmm. And he got old, and they replaced, but there was a big contretemps. They replaced him with a guy called Thomas Jolly John. Now his nickname was Jolly, but everybody knew him as Jolly. So today, all you hear is Jolly John. Mm-hmm. But the administrator of that day, that's the one that Bell had gone back to England. He retired. Mm-hmm. But the new one that came was this guy called E.C. Eliot. Eliot Avenue right here, it's named after him. And Eliot did not like Hesketh Bell. He did not like what he had done for the Kalinagos. He said he just confused matters. Why didn't he just leave everything alone and everybody would merge up and you wouldn't have this complication? So he really did not like Bell, and he was suspicious about Jolly John. And then you have the Kalinago War. Now that is when this guy Eliot tries to stop the people from doing what they have done for thousands of years, and that is sailing, rowing in their canoes up and down the islands with the freedom, with no boundaries. And all of a sudden, in 1930, they decided, these Kalinagos are smuggling. They're going and getting food and whatever from other islands, and they're bringing it in, and they're just coming into Salibia. And so we're going to send police after them. And so on the 19th of September, 1930, the members of the Dominica police force, in those days we were part of the Leeward Islands, so it was made up of a lot of Antiguans and Kittian police that didn't even speak Creole. So they didn't understand anything. Anyway, they came in and they attacked, they seized things. Well, of course, the Kalinagos reacted and they chased them out of the territory all the way back to Pegua because the nearest police station was in Maragot. So they chained, they threw stones, all the things they seized, they got from them. Ha! With that now, Elliot sent a telegram to a warship, the HMS Delhi, that was in Trinidad, and he said, "Come, there's a rising." Well, he kind of exaggerated it. There's this big rising that's going on, and come and deal with the Caribs. That's the boat. I have a photograph of the boat in the book. And so the boat came alongside. It couldn't anchor because of the rough sea. And it let off these star shells in the night. The night it arrived, there were two things: searchlights, and these searchlights are powerful. You can see them in the old movies, and they just passed the searchlights all over the hills. The people were terrified. They ran from their houses. They went up in the bush, and then the star shells now would they weren't like bombs, but they would travel over, and then they burst open. So, I mean, if you're living a quiet life up in the territory and this happens to you, obviously you're going to be terrified, right? Anyway, the police now came back because they wanted to round up the ringleaders, and they fired into the crowd, and two Kalinagos were killed. Well, that now raised up everything even worse again. And then eventually they arrested the people they thought were ringleaders, and they brought them to Roseau to be tried. They did not arrest Jolly John. But because these were his people and they were down in Roseau, he put on his best clothes and he walked. In those days, you had to walk all the way to Roseau. Now, the police headquarters was where Fort Young is today. So he goes in and he says, "Look, I've come to support the people who are." Oh, they arrested him one time. And worse, when the court case was being heard, a policeman stripped him, took off his nice jacket, his belt, his shoes. They record all of this. Like to belittle him then. So instead of going into the court like a chief in his Sunday best, he went in, just like a person with bare feet and whatever. Anyway, amazingly, the Roseau people were so against the governor, the administrator, that they found all of the Kalinagos not guilty. They said there was no case to answer, totally not guilty. So they were let off and they went back to the territory. But that marked a beginning now of what I call in the book the revival. So you have sent this warship, you attacked us, you belittled our chief. They even took away the staff and the sash, and they took it away, the British authorities. And they didn't give it back to them until they begged and begged, and then in 1952, they got back the staff that is used today. Yeah? And then, of course, we even go further. When we get in the 70s, get up, stand up for your rights. Bob Marley, all of that was going on. Dominica was really action-packed and alive. The early days of Midnight Groovers and Zouk and all the messages that were being passed, Bob Marley and all of his lyrics, all of that was affecting Dominica, and it affected the young Kalinagos as well. So they also, for the first time, that was the first generation that had gone to secondary school, and they'd learned all about, the history and the background. And the country, the island, was being influenced by all of these spokespersons. And so they then, just like what was happening among the kind of Rasta groups and the Black Power and all that, they themselves decided, boy, let's see what's happening elsewhere in the world with the First Nations group and the Aboriginal groups in whether it's Australia or Canada or North America or the Spanish Americas, and let us kind of rise up. And so that's when the thing started. And then before independence in 1978, they approached the British government and they said, "You're sending us into independence, but we have no legislation to cover us or to cover the land. And how is this chieftaincy going to continue? You're sending us into independence with nothing." And so the British then put a bit of pressure on the local government under Patrick John, and then in 1978, just before independence, what was called the Carib Reserve Act of 1978 was passed, and then it was changed, of course, to the Kalinago Act. And then by that time, in 1974, Dominica constituencies had increased. We had 11 constituencies, and they increased it to 21, and they created the Salibia constituency. Because before that, the constituency was the northeast, and it was very big. It went all the way to Vegas and down through Wesley and Marigot and whatever.
Why isn't Concord and Atkinson part of the Kalinago territory?
It should be, but you see, at the time, and I talk about this, I have a map, the original map, which still sits in the Public Records Office in England. When Bell was doing this, he just left it at those boundaries. Now, Atkinson could not really be in it because Atkinson people had title for their land. All these French families, Rabes and all these people, they had title. So you had to make the boundary at Atkinson. But you could have sent it further down, closer to Castle Bruce, which was done a bit later under the UWP in 1997. They extended it a bit south. And then, in fact, what happened is the Kalinagos themselves basically took over the whole of Concord. So the boundary is the river, like saying now from the river to the sea. So it's from the river to the sea now, from the Pigua River to the Atlantic Ocean over the hills. So it has increased in size, but the problem was that there was so much contention. There was a guy called William Davies and a whole section who argued, you see, that, and there was a racial thing in it too, because he now was a mixed planter for Concord Estate, and he was saying, oh, but Hesketh Bell has preference. His preference for the Kalinago, for the Carib people, and he giving them everything. And there are all these black people from Where's Marigot and other people who have a little garden here, a little garden there, and you're not giving them the garden, but you're going to give Kalinagos all of this land, So there was a lot of contention. I quote all the documents here. And eventually, there were, up to now, I think, if people don't think, they don't realize, there is no official map of Dominica on which you will see the Carib Reserve or the Kalinago territory. You will see in a tourist map, which is unofficial. Somebody has drawn in Kalinago territory. But on an official state-produced government map of Dominica, you will not find the boundaries, you will not find the name. So almost as if it doesn't exist, because they don't, from early on, from the 1900s, they did not want to put it because there was always a difference of opinion over the next mountain or the next ravine or the next stream,
But as we wind down, Doc, because of time, we have the news. Give us the information as to where the book can be found locally and online and even regionally.
Of course, it can internationally already. They're buying it on Amazon.com. And it's Resistance, Refuge, Revival, Lennox Honey Church. It's also produced by Papillot Press. Papillot Press is a small press company based in Dominica, at Trafalgar, at Papillot, but it also is based in England. So you can buy it on Amazon, but within Dominica, Jay's Bookstore and Zeb Creole, which is a stall in the covered part of the Roseau Market. And then there's a bookshop and gift shop in the departure lounge at Douglas Charles Airport. On the way out, you can buy it there.
At what price?
$40.
I would have loved to, or possibly you could appreciate lessons learned from the whole Kalinago experience and how important they are and how we should actually treat them based on the history and like your book says, based on the resistance, refuge, revival of the Kalinago people, how we should treat them as a people.
Oh, well, of course, I could have added another R, respect. You see, because what happened is that was the problem. They were not being treated with respect for generations until with the revival, they themselves, and many of them are still alive, Irving Sogeist and Jacob Frederick and all these people, they still exist, where they basically were pushing the message, have respect for us.
Yeah, because I would love to go even into at some point in time they were treated like second class.
They were, definite.
Citizens. Well, I mean, we are now getting accustomed to the history, and that's why this book is so
Yeah.
important.
All these terms like Malquaib and this, and I mean, they would say, oh, there's a term, mouton batali, like people just following one another. Well, in a way, they used to say the same thing about the Kalinagos when they came to Roseau, because they had been through those forest tracks, one behind the other. So when they came to Roseau, the most senior who knows Roseau, they'll follow them in a line all over Roseau.
Absolutely.
So they used to make jokes and all that. So they
ridicule them.
So all of that they had to go through even in the 20th century. And that is why what happened in the 1970s and onwards with all those names that I have mentioned is very important, because they really did a lot to, build up respect.
I would want us to do a part two, but possibly viral, online. Because why the language?
Mm-hmm.
And we saw.
Oh, well, that language is a program in itself.
So that's why I say, but I would prefer this time, knowing how we have to reach the town, we could possibly do it online, you in your facility, and we can possibly, because right now I just have to talk to the technician.
That's right.
So we can do a part two, possibly virtual.
Yes, because all the place names, I have a map in there with the place names we still use today. Kulibistri, Layu, Koliho, all these places.
And I would also, like to do, besides the places, why wouldn't a book like that be part of the curriculum,
well, maybe one day a simplified version. Maybe sometimes it's a little heavy for a child. I did this as my doctoral degree in Oxford University. And of course, there's a big chunk at the back, because writing a book like this is like presenting a case in law.
Can we make a date for the online part two next week, Friday? Online, you'll be in your facility. And
contact me closer to the date.
All right, that was Dr. Lennox Honeychurch. We'd have loved to open the lines and for allow people to interact, but we try to compact the information once again in the book entitled "Resistance, Refuge, and Revival." Dr. Lennox Honeychurch, the Indigenous Kalinagos of Dominica, available at Jay's Bookstore and online on Amazon. This was another Creole Heartbeat program. I want to thank you, Doctor, one of my true mentors, and the encouragement you have even given me in my own research of the cadence slips of music. I'm still within the tree. You probably speak.
I know, I haven't found it
yet. The cadence slips of tree. Another Creole Heartbeat program with Dr. Lennox Honeychurch. The news major comes up next on the big station. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Prince